Salesmen of imagination always offer their wares in such terminology that the advantages of those wares to the prospective purchaser are obvious. It is seldom that any man makes a purchase of merchandise or renders another a favor just to accommodate the salesman. It is a prominent trait of human nature that prompts us all to do that which advances our own interests. This is a cold, indisputable fact, claims of the idealist to the contrary notwithstanding. To be perfectly plain, men are selfish. To understand the truth is to understand how to present your case, whether you are asking for the release of a man from prison or offering for sale some commodity. In your own imagination, so plan your presentation of your case that the strongest and most impelling advantages to the buyer are made plain. This is imagination. A farmer moved to the city, taking with him his well-trained shepherd dog. He soon found that the dog was out of place in the city, so he decided to, quote, get rid of him, unquote. Note the words in quotation. Taking the dog with him, he went out into the country and rapped on the door of a farmhouse. A man came hobbling to the door on crutches. The man with the dog greeted the man in the house with these words. "You wouldn't care to buy a fine shepherd dog that I wish to get rid of, would you?" The man on crutches replied, "No," and closed the door. The man with the dog called at half a dozen other farmhouses, asking the same question, and received the same answer. He made up his mind that no one wanted the dog and returned it to the city. That evening he was telling of his misfortune to a man of imagination. The man heard how the owner of the dog had tried in vain to get rid of him. "Let me dispose of the dog for you," said the man of imagination. The owner was willing. The next morning the man of imagination took the dog out into the country and stopped at the first farmhouse at which the owner of the dog had called the day before. The same old man hobbled out on crutches and answered the knock at the door. The man of imagination greeted him in this fashion. "I see you are all crippled with rheumatism. What you need is a fine dog to run errands for you. I have a dog here that has been trained to bring home the cows, drive away wild animals, herd the sheep, and perform other useful services. You may have this dog for $100. "All right," said the crippled man. "I'll take him." That, too, was imagination. No one wants a dog that someone else wants to get rid of, but most anyone would like to own a dog that would herd sheep and bring home the cows and perform other useful services. The dog was the same one that the crippled buyer had refused the day before, but the man who sold the dog was not the man who had tried to get rid of him. If you use your imagination, you will know that no one wants anything that someone else is trying to get rid of. Remember that which was said about the law of attraction, through the operation of which like attracts like. If you look and act the part of a failure, you will attract nothing but failures. Whatever your life work may be, it calls for the use of imagination. Niagara Falls was nothing but a great mass of roaring water until a man of imagination harnessed it and converted the wasted energy into electric current that now turns the wheels of industry. Before this man of imagination came along, millions of people had seen and heard those roaring falls, but lacked the imagination to harness them. The first Rotary Club of the world was born in the fertile imagination of Paul Harris of Chicago, who saw in this child of his brain an effective means of cultivating prospective clients and the extension of his law practice. The ethics of the legal profession forbid advertising in the usual way, but Paul Harris's imagination found a way to extend his law practice without advertising in the usual way. If the winds of fortune are temporarily blowing against you, remember that you can harness them and make them carry you toward your definite purpose, through the use of your imagination. A kite rises against the wind, not with it. Dr. Frank Crane was a struggling third-rate preacher until the starvation wages of the clergy forced him to use his imagination. Now he earns upward of $100,000 a year for an hour's work a day writing essays. Bud Fisher once worked for a mere pittance, but he now earns $75,000 a year by making folks grin with his Mutt and Jeff comic strip. No art goes into his drawings, therefore he must be selling his imagination. Woolworth was a poorly paid clerk in a retail store, poorly paid perhaps because he had not yet found out that he had imagination. Before he died, he built the tallest office building in the world and girdled the United States with 5 and 10 cent stores through the use of his imagination. You will observe, by analyzing these illustrations, that a close study of human nature played an important part in the achievements mentioned. To make profitable use of your imagination, you must make it give you a keen insight into the motives that cause men to do or refrain from doing a given act. If your imagination leads you to understand how quickly people grant your requests when those requests appeal to their self-interest, you can have practically anything you go after. I saw my wife make a very clever sale to our baby not long ago. The baby was pounding the top of our mahogany library table with a spoon. When my wife reached for the spoon, the baby refused to give it up, but being a woman of imagination, she offered the baby a nice stick of red candy. He dropped the spoon immediately and centered his attention on the more desirable object. That was imagination. It was also salesmanship. She won her point without using force. I was riding in an automobile with a friend who was driving beyond the speed limit. An officer rode up on a motorcycle and told my friend he was under arrest for speeding. The friend smiled pleasantly at the officer and said, "I'm sorry to have brought you out in all this rain, but I wanted to make the 10 o'clock train with my friend here, and I was hitting it up around 35 miles an hour. "No, you were only going 28 miles an hour, replied the officer, "and as long as you are so nice about it, I will let you off this time, if you will watch yourself hereafter." And that, too, was imagination. Even a traffic cop will listen to reason when approached in the right manner, but woe unto the motorist who tries to bully the cop into believing his speedometer was not registering properly. There is one form of imagination against which I would caution you. It is the brand which prompts some people to imagine that they can get something for nothing, or that they can force themselves ahead in the world without observing the rights of others. There are more than 160,000 prisoners in the penal institutions of the United States, practically every one of whom is in prison because he imagined he could play the game of life without observing the rights of his fellow men. There is a man in the Ohio penitentiary who has served more than 35 years of time for forgery, and the largest amount he ever got from his misapplication of imagination was $12. There are a few people who direct their imaginations in the vain attempt to work out a way to show what happens when an immovable body comes in contact with an irresistible force. But these types belong in the psychopathic hospitals. There is also another form of misapplied imagination, namely that of the young boy or girl who knows more about life than his or her dad. But this form is subject to modification with time. My own boys have taught me many things that my dad tried in vain to teach me when I was their age. Time and imagination, which is often but the product of time, teach us many things, but nothing of more importance than this, that all men are much alike in many ways. If you would know what your customer is thinking, Mr. Salesman, study yourself and find out what you would be thinking if you were in your customer's place. Study yourself. Find out what are the motives which actuate you in the performance of certain deeds and cause you to refrain from performing other deeds, and you will have gone far toward perfecting yourself in the accurate use of imagination. The detective's biggest asset is imagination. The first question he asks when called in to solve a crime is, what was the motive? If he can find out the motive, he can usually find the perpetrator of the crime. A man who had lost a horse posted a reward of $5 for its return. Several days later, a boy who was supposed to have been weak-minded came leading the horse home and claimed the reward. The owner was curious to know how the boy found the horse. "How did you ever think where to look for the horse?" he asked, and the boy replied, "Well, I just thought where I would have gone if I had been a horse and went there, and he had." Not so bad for a weak-minded fellow. Some who are not accused of being weak-minded go all the way through life without displaying as much evidence of imagination as did this boy. If you want to know what the other fellow will do, use your imagination. Put yourself in his place and find out what you would have done. That's imagination. Every person should be somewhat of a dreamer. Every business needs the dreamer. Every industry and every profession needs him. But the dreamer must be also a doer, or else he must form an alliance with someone who can and does translate dreams into reality. The greatest nation upon the face of this earth was conceived, born, and nurtured through the early days of its childhood as the result of imagination in the minds of men who combined dreams with action. Your mind is capable of creating many new and useful combinations of old ideas, But the most important thing it can create is a definite chief aim that will give you that which you most desire. Your definite chief aim can be speedily translated into reality after you have fashioned it in the cradle of your imagination. If you have faithfully followed the instructions set down for your guidance in Lesson 2, you are now well on the road toward success because you know what it is you want, and you have a plan for getting that which you want. The battle for the achievement of success is half won when one knows definitely what is wanted. The battle is all over except the shouting when one knows what is wanted and has made up his mind to get it whatever the price may be. The selection of a definite chief aim calls for the use of both imagination and decision. The power of decision grows with use. Prompt decision in forcing the imagination to create a definite chief aim renders more powerful the capacity to reach decisions in other matters. Adversities and temporary defeat are generally blessings in disguise, for the reason that they force one to use both imagination and decision. This is why a man usually makes a better fight when his back is to the wall and he knows there is no retreat. He then reaches the decision to fight instead of running.